let's start with coronavirus, because in the last half hour or so, the government has set out its battle plan for how to deal with COVID-19. So what's going to happen?
Off to you.
Oh, okay.
I'm going to leave it up to
that
you.
was unexpected.
I thought it was going.
So one of the things that the government has planned is to recall retired doctors and nurses, to call them back into service to help with the scale, potentially, of what could be a crisis with the coronavirus. This has been received with some skepticism, it's fair to say. I mean, obviously, I think a lot of our health service does rely on the goodwill and hard work of healthcare professionals. You walk into any hospital and that is just self-evidently true, that people are working incredibly hard because they care. But it's not as though the government has, fostered that goodwill and good relations. So there are questions raised over that. And also the idea that retired healthcare professionals, who presumably are in a group that's most at risk, over 65s, from coronavirus, would be the ones brought back in.
This so-called Dad's Army.
So-called Dad's Army. There's other options that the government is apparently discussing. There's a, quote, social distancing strategy as well, which will involve encouraging people to work from home, so there isn't that much,
Yes, a
travel.
social distancing strategy, indeed, it's being called.
Yes, I suppose the irony of that would be that as we're sort of moving towards a slightly more remote economy where more and more people are able to work at home, it would have been slightly more beneficial if we'd perhaps got to that stage a little bit quicker. Then there would have been less chance of people interacting who might have been potentially contagious. But actually, the point that Rachel makes is the one that immediately stands out to me, this idea of the Dad's Army of doctors and nurses who are, of course, presumably, if they are past the point of retirement, they're going to be at the most vulnerable age group. And I don't think, most doctors and nurses, as we know, they do it out of a sense of duty and the idea of helping people. But actually, I don't think, even those people who do like to help are not going to be particularly au fait with the idea of being press-ganged back into service because the government is unprepared, and to deal with something that is directly going to be very dangerous to them personally, them interacting with it. Something else that stood out to me, though, in the Telegraph article is it says that Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor, is considering rewriting parts of his budget to try to meet head-on this crisis. And that does not fill me with any great sense of reassurance of the idea of having already written a budget, he's now desperately rewriting it because he finds that what he's already apportioned to the health service isn't good enough to deal with the event, an outbreak of a pandemic.
Well, I mean, we've just come out of possibly the worst week on global stock markets since 2008, haven't we? Which is going to force some rapid rethinking about
even so, though, you would hope that there were emergency plans in place that would not require a government to completely rewrite parts of its budget, that there would be protocols in place, that there would be funds set aside. And I'm sure that they're saying this, and I'm sure, again, they'll make that point that we've just seen a great deal of value wiped off global stock markets. That's not really an excuse to say, oh, well, we didn't see this coming. Of course, a pandemic was always going to cause serious issues on global, economic links and that sort of thing. I'm sure, like I said, I'm sure that they're meaning it to sound reassuring, but to me that just sounds like a government that, admittedly, this government has only been in power for a few months, but still, that doesn't sound like a government that is on top of the problem.
The Sunday Times as well, its take on this is work at home, the virus doomsday plan. I mean, we're already seeing travel being restricted in terms of flying, companies advising staff not to travel unless they really have to. And this is suggesting in the government's plan people are going to start to need to work from home a lot more.
That's one of the suggestions, and it is worth pointing out when it comes to the health service. This government has been in power since December, but the Conservatives have been in power for 10 years, and in those 10 years they have cut the NHS and social care drastically, and to the point where the service is on its knees. There is already a shortage, as we know, of nurses and doctors.
What about hospital beds?
Hospital beds, 10,000 short, and that's before we deal with the crisis. That's the default. That is a shortage and an underfunded situation. But yes, this idea of people working from home, I think the problem is which is partly illuminated by the revelation that there's a man in Surrey who has coronavirus and has not travelled. So this is the first instance of somebody catching it in the UK. And I think that the issue is with this virus is it does seem very easily transmitted. It seems quite easily passed from person to person.
Infectious.
It's highly contagious. And we don't quite know what the contagion period is. We don't know what the symptoms are by which you can determine that someone is contagious.
Well, and those symptoms, of course, common colds and coughs at a time.
Indeed.
We are all suffering from colds and coughs. I do want to move us on to talk about Boris Johnson, but Matt Hancock, the Health Secretary, has said that he has every confidence in our nation's ability to respond to the threat of COVID-19. The UK is a world leader in preparing for and managing disease outbreaks, and public safety is our top priority, and this war room to be convened in the Cabinet Office to meet regularly. Let's take a look now at the other news of the day. The news that Boris Johnson is to become a father again, Carrie Symonds to become a mother for the first time, a baby for Number 10, and a wedding.
Yes, and most of our papers have, in their wisdom, decided to splash with that news on a day when you might say that there is much more newsworthy news that merits our attention. And you could also say that if the press were doing its job properly, it would see fit to prioritise some other stories on its front pages, aside from the fact that this couple are expecting, which of course
Carrie to go into labour is the
news.
Headline in the Sunday Mirror.
I'm sure they were delighted when they came out with that. And it must be said, the first thing to say is she is a young woman, and this is, as far as we know, her first pregnancy. It must be a very exciting time. So congratulations to her.
Yes.
I don't think that we want to see anybody sinking, as we have seen online, to sort of nasty comments. I'm sure it's a very happy occasion for her and for Mr. Johnson.
As it is for
However,
all
of course,
families.
for all families. However, as has just been touched upon, we've got the Telegraph, we've got the Mirror, we've got the Times, we've got the Observer, we've got the Mail. Everybody leads with this. In the build-up to this segment of the programme, it was discussed that today there was the announcement that there was going to be a deal between the United States and the Taliban to bring to an end the conflict there. There are, as we speak, a vicious conflict happening in northern Syria, in Idlib. There are tens of thousands of refugees amassing on the border. And the thing that I find actually really quite angering about this whole thing, that they've chosen today to make this announcement. And a lot of people are saying it's it's not fair to say that it's been done to bury bad news. But this was also the day that there was a revelation that Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe, who, as we all remember, has been held essentially hostage by the Iranian regime for the last few years, and whether we like it or not, Mr. Johnson has played a very negligible role in that whole sorry saga. It was revealed today that she is suspected of having the coronavirus. She is on a wing in the IRGC-run prison in Afrin that has got cases of coronavirus. She's not got access to any medical facility. She's in solitary confinement. And yet this is the story that we're leading with, not that story. This is the thing that we're going with. And I think, frankly, that's a disgrace.
Well, I should say we're going to be speaking to Nazanin's husband, Richard Ratcliffe, on Sky News tomorrow. But you're right. And if we can bring up the Sunday Times front page again now, it has your take on it, Benedict Spence. What a good day to announce a number 10 baby. So wonderful news. People congratulating them, but also questioning potentially the timing of this.
Yes.
Because we are also going to be talking after the break about the Home Office and the row over Priti Patel.
Well, absolutely, and I don't think it's too unfair to say that this is far too conveniently timed for all of these happening, especially seeing as actually her pregnancy and the rumours of their engagement has been fairly common knowledge around Westminster for months now. And, you know, it even goes as far as to say, actually, this all happened in December. People were aware of this.
Yes,
so for it to be
there
revealed
were several
today,
people pointing out on social media that because it was February the 29th, had she popped the question, beginning a leap year, but actually, as Carrie Symonds herself has confirmed on her Instagram feed, they got engaged at the end of the year.
I just find it far too convenient, and I'm very, very upset about it, very angry about it.
Let's take a break. Coming up, could Priti Patel resign after the Home Office's top civil servant quits? We'll be talking about that after the break. Benedict Spence. So let's turn to to the front of the Observer now. And an extraordinary statement today from the most senior civil servant at the Home Office, now departed from that department, about his relationship with Priti Patel.
Yes, this is Sir Philip Rutnam, who is going to be bringing a case against the government, it turns out, on grounds of unfair dismissal. Allegations being made that Priti Patel has been, shall we say, less than a positive influence on the department since she turned up. Accusations of bullying, his own words, a vicious campaign against him, shouting, swearing, making demands that were unreasonable on people, and creating an environment of fear that needed bravery to call out. It is just another bad story in these opening sort of few months of the government for how different departments are being run, how ministers might be being treated or treating the people that work for them. And I have to say, again, it's just in the aftermath of this coronavirus story that doesn't particularly fill you with confidence. The Home Office is undergoing. It's not exactly undergoing a great time at the moment, given that it's going to be at the forefront of everything from we're trying to bring in this new immigration system that we're talking about the points-based system and exiting the European Union. It's going to be at the forefront of having to deal with applications of people who want to stay in the UK from the European Union. And on top of that, we've got things like the Windrush scandal that are still ongoing. To then actually have a minister parachuted in who it turns out is accused of bullying.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. I was about to come on to that. Said that she categorically denies. It's not an edifying look at all. Now, as you say, we've only heard one side. We've only heard Sir Philip's side of the story, but ultimately we have to wait and hear what Priti Patel has to say. But it's for me, it's launched an interesting response, which seems to be that a lot of Conservatives, as you would expect, a lot of Tories are sort of closing ranks. They're sort of closing round the wagons around Priti Patel to defend her to the hilt. But there is an element of, I think, hypocrisy in this, in that a lot of people are just blankly saying, no, absolutely not. Priti Patel is, this is a campaign against her. This is just the word of one man, and of course, the Mandarins are all going to.
Maybe tough.
Of course, that's what they will say. But of course, they weren't saying these things about John Bercow when allegations were made against him when he was Speaker of the House of Commons. When bullying allegations were made against him, there were immediate calls that he should resign, that he shouldn't be given a peerage just before anything had been proven, simply on the grounds of allegations. And I think that shows a real double standard, frankly, in how we are treating these two cases.
That story also on the front of the Sunday Times. Calls from some, Sir Keir Starmer among them, for Priti Patel to make a statement to the House on Monday.
I think it's really interesting that, some people are defending her. This, let's remember, is the person who in 2017 had to resign because she'd made covert trips to Israel, which were unauthorized, and reportedly also including telling Israeli officials that potentially international aid money could be used for the Israeli army to run hospitals in the Golan Heights, all of which, highly irregular, highly, what should we call it?
Morally questionable.
She had to resign. That's putting it mildly. This is the person who was given the position of Home Office. I mean, it's absolutely absurd that someone was allowed to behave in that way and make the comeback that she did.
If I may, very quickly, though, there is one thing that I wanted to come on to, which was there's this mantra that's been going around, this idea, the way that people like Dominic Cummings, this new wave that have come into Number 10 operate.
This relationship between civil service and government.
Well, more that their attitude is to move fast and break things. That to try to get reform, you just need to keep people on their toes, and that Priti Patel, in some ways, has been parachuted into the Home Office to act as a wrecking ball, in some ways, in order to facilitate the change that Number 10 wants. And the funny thing with that is, of course, given that she has a past that, under normal circumstances, I think would have ruled her out ever getting to this kind of office, it does make her very easy to replace if she becomes too toxic, say, to carry on, but at the same time is able to carry out a lot of the government's dirty work, because ultimately, what have they got to lose with this individual?
It was suggested this week, though, that perhaps the way in which Priti Patel is being viewed for being tough in the Home Office is because she's female, that she's getting a harder time, that there's an element of misogyny here. Rachel?
I think what's important to remember is that Priti Patel she's not a rogue element in this government. She is of a piece with the way Boris Johnson and Dominic Cummings are operating. You know, just last week, we had a former cabinet minister say that they had a hit list of civil servants, one in the Home Office, one in the Foreign Office, and there was another one, there was a third. This is their style of operation. She is pursuing the same style. She's not running off at a tangent. So, yes, we can point the finger at her, but I think we need to point the finger at this entire government and their style of operation, which is obviously causing the civil service considerable distress.
Just before we run out of time, let's have a very quick look at the Star. Quackers, the headline there, plastic ducks banned from a charity race.
Well, yes.
On grounds of littering the environment, it's generally a bad idea to throw lots of plastic ducks into rivers and make them race.
It's hundreds of ducks, isn't it?
I mean-
Hundreds of plastic ducks. It's quite a lot of plastic.
Yeah, it's a
Into the
family
water.
event which raises thousands for good causes. Apparently they were told to use lemons instead. But that's as far as my paper goes.
When
so I can't
when
tell
life
you
gives you
anymore.
lemons.
I haven't got the next page.
But the lemon would sink, surely.
Let's find out
Or not.
next hour.
To test.
How many people are gathering for this race? Because given that we're all supposed to be in self-isolation, I think that's probably the larger worry.
We
wouldn't
may go
it be?
down the route of France, banning gatherings of more than 5,000, of course. Benedict and Rachel, thank you both very much. We'll see you in half an hour. Now, let's take a look at the weather. Thousands of refugees have been attempting to get into Greece after Turkey opened its western border. But there were ugly scenes today with Greek security forces firing tear gas to try and keep people out. Turkey is using the refugees to put pressure on Europe to give them more help in Syria. From the Turkish border, our Middle East correspondent.
Are kept in Turkey since 2012. Why? How many? Where are you from?
UK.
UK. How many refugees you have in UK?
Not that many.
Why? Do we have to keep all these people?
In the Sky News in Turkey.
Storm Jorge has brought heavy rain and strong winds. And we're joined tonight by journalist and author Rachel Shabby and writer Benedict Spence. Hello again to you both. So we're going to kick off with the Telegraph and the government's battle plan for coronavirus, which involves calling back retired doctors and nurses if required.
Yeah, not entirely clear how this is going to work, but it's been dubbed Dad's Army to fight the virus. They are looking at recalling former health professionals to bring them out of retirement under emergency plans being considered, some other plans being put in place in case the situation escalates. Not really clear how you're going to recall them. Are you going to rehire them? This is a population of people who are retired, therefore over 65, therefore the group that is especially vulnerable to coronavirus. And also there's, you know, just the bigger question of why would they want to come back having been retired? And it's not as though this government in the last 10 years has particularly fostered great relationships with health workers and health professionals who...
Not
you
just
know,
this government, though, is it? If you think about junior doctors, for example.
well, this government, as in the government of the last 10 years, has been the one that has come most under fire for the treatment of the NHS. We're now looking at staff shortages already, shortages in beds or shortages of nurses before having to deal potentially with an escalation. And, you know, so that this policy is something that has raised eyebrows, I think it's fair to say.
And yours?
I'm always curious as to what it is that we mean when people always seem to invoke Dad's Army, that sort of spirit, and when everything from Brexit now to the outbreak of the coronavirus, people seem to forget that the whole premise of that show was that it was a complete and utter farce, and that it actually just ends up going well in spite of itself. But, you know, I digress. I think it's ever so slightly concerning that we currently find ourselves in this position with a global pandemic sort of on the horizon and now in fact here. And ultimately, there doesn't seem to be much in terms of a sort of joined up, coordinated response in terms of simple public information. Now, you know,
Isn't that what this is about now? This
But this is the
battle plan
point.
and
It's
a new
just
war
come
room
out.
set up to
It's just
communicate?
come out today. We're reading about it now in the front pages. How long has it been on the front pages of the world that there is a potential pandemic heading our way? It's been here since last year. We were aware of this thing in China, and reading some of the details about the Chancellor potentially rewriting parts of his budget sort of ad hoc to deal with this. I understand the argument. People say, well, the outbreak of the virus has wiped billions off the global stock markets, but actually that's something that you would imagine a global pandemic was always going to do anyway, as whenever it happens, it always causes large economic upheaval. It's the sort of thing that the Treasury should have plans in place for. So the idea that we're doing this now, that we're sort of being jolted into action, and that the response is to get people to come out of retirement, as Rachel says, people who are in the age bracket that is the most vulnerable to this outbreak, it doesn't actually inspire any sense of confidence, but actually, just really basic things like, we're talking about this concept of self-isolation. What does that mean? Exactly. If you live in a family environment, do you lock yourself away from the rest of your family? Do you not interact with people that come to your door? How do you go about doing your job? Lots of people are saying, well, the government is suggesting people maybe work from home, but that's not a straightforward
Sunday Times, if we have a
Yes.
look at that, part of this virus doomsday plan.
But how are you supposed to do that as an individual? Does your company have a plan in place for that? If it doesn't, well, what are you meant to do? Presumably, they're going to assume that you're going to turn up to work, because otherwise...
Some jobs are easier to be done
Well, exactly.
from home as
Some
well,
others,
aren't they?
but there doesn't actually appear to be much in terms of planning for that discrepancy in different people's circumstances.
Even the Foreign Secretary, we've learned this week, had to self-isolate because he was feeling unwell, since returned to work because he'd had a negative test. But as you say, this document, which has been released by the government this evening, gives us lots of proposals, but perhaps raises more questions as well about how it might work in practice.
Well, that's right. I think it's raising a lot of questions the way the government has handled this, and part of the reason is that the government has not allowed its own ministers on some flagship programs. BBC Today program. I don't think ministers have been going on Channel 4 News either, and it seems a little bit childish, along with a lot of other things, to do that at a time when you're dealing with a health crisis and public information is key. So that's one of the things. The other issue here, of course, is that when we look at things like people working from home, it does raise the question as well of, people need to know that they can take days off sick and they will be paid for them.
Oh, we did hear that from the Health Secretary last week, that if you have to self-isolate, then you will be entitled to sick pay. And
but
that's
it's
really
certainly not
important.
coming
But if
as...
you're self-employed, I'm not entirely
But also, it's not coming as part, until today, it's not really come as part of a coherent strategy.
Exactly.
There's been no sort of government webpage that's got everything on it. It's just been a sort of a drip feed of what it sounds like almost sort of do-it-yourself policies. The idea of bringing back retired doctors, that kind of just sounds like, well, let's try that.
Sounds like they made it up on the hoof,
Well, this is
doesn't
the
it?
thing.
I mean,
One
it's
does
very-
admire the very plucky spirit of people in this country. That doesn't mean that the government has to partake in that plucky, well, let's just give it a go and see what happens spirit. One would hope that there was a little bit more in the way of preparation, and one doesn't like to play party politics with things when it comes to a pandemic or anything like that. But I am reminded of Damien McBride pointing out that when New Labour had the foot and mouth outbreak, I think it was, there were, from the get-go, regular meetings, regular, public information broadcasts. They were actually on top of this. And given that that was something that affected livestock, not human beings, I find that a slightly staggering difference in response.
Let's look at what else might have been occupying the Prime Minister's mind then on the front of the Sunday Mirror. Carry to go into Labour is the Mirror's headline, because we've learnt today that the Prime Minister and his partner are having a baby.
Yes, and the first thing to say is, of course, it is a very... it's happy news for the couple, and congratulations to them. But as I alluded to in the last half of this program, it is not a serious news story, and I slightly lost my temper over this, because actually what this does is it's splashed over all the front pages of the newspapers, everything from the Observer to the Telegraph, and it is occupying space when there are, in my opinion, I think possibly in Rachel's opinion, possibly in lots of people's opinion, far more important stories that need to be addressed. Now, Sky, as we heard at the top of this program, you discussed the Taliban agreement with the United States. That was a conflict that this country sent men and women to die in. And we're now having a deal that is being proposed that essentially cedes control of the country back.
Hugely significant.
Back, all the way back to the Taliban. After all of that, it's got not a mention of it. Not a single front page, not a mention of it. I mentioned Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe. I won't go too much into that again. But again, it is a disgrace that that isn't being mentioned. But the Prime Minister, who played a very central role in, condemning her to an even longer period in Iran, this happy story about him is on the front page. There are
Nazanin,
many...
we should say, whose family suspects she may have.
Yes, that's the key part of the story.
COVID-19.
It's just, for me, I don't want to be accused of being, a killjoy or anything like that. Yes, it's wonderful news, but actually, it isn't really what you'd call a newsworthy story when there are other things so much more pressing going on in the world.
The
It is
Sunday Times
actually-
probably reflects your cynicism a little in its headline, doesn't it?
Good for them, yes.
What a good day to announce
They
a
do
number 10
right next to the
baby.
large picture.
It is the only one. It is an absolute disgrace to see these newspapers today. I mean, it's one thing for the government, the Prime Minister, to try and bury a bad news day, but it's another thing for our press, which is supposed to be independent, to comply with him and to allow him to do this. On the day when we're looking at all sorts of news, as you say, Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe should be on all the front pages. That is a utter disgrace that she is still in prison in Iran to begin with. Then we've got coronavirus. We've got terrible story of complete chaos at the Home Office with this shock
Those
resignation.
all on the front pages with that story about
But
Boris
still, but
Johnson
look at
and
the
Carrie
way
Symonds.
the
build-up of-
Daily
the
Mail,
build- the
look at
build-up of
Telegraph.
refugees
This is
in Turkey.
shocking. There is no way around this. This is an embarrassment.
And I tell you
of
what,
the
actually,
press
I tell you
to be
what.
covering it in this way.
I tell you what, she's an expectant mother. Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe is a mother whose child doesn't have access to her. And
Yeah, exactly.
I will just stop talking about it because it does infuriate
Well,
me.
we,
Yeah,
we will be talking
rightly.
to Nazanin's husband, Richard Ratcliffe, tomorrow at around midday on Sky News and to find out exactly what is happening with her. Let's take a short break. Coming up, we'll be taking a look through the rest of the papers.
Could Priti Patel resign after the Home Office's top civil servant quit today? We'll be looking at that story.
Benedict Spence. Let's turn to the Observer now, and alongside its photo of Boris Johnson and Carrie Symonds, it has a story about Priti Patel, the row over the most senior civil servant in the Home Office who has resigned today and is going to sue.
Yeah, it was extraordinary to see that today. The Home Office chief, he called Patel a lying bully. He resigned over that, and he said he would be pursuing a legal case over potentially unfair dismissal, which is an extraordinary thing to watch a civil servant do that, not usually known for being so forthright.
And only a week after we had this joint statement between he and Priti Patel suggesting that they were working together in a fine manner.
That's right, but it's also a week after we've heard, repeated reports that permanent secretaries in the civil service were in the firing line, not just in Priti Patel's department, but in the Foreign Office and the Treasury as well. And Dominic Cummings' persistent rumblings about wanting to reform the civil service. So there is a pattern here. The Observer is reporting that her future is in doubt, Priti Patel, after this explosive announcement today. But this is the same Priti Patel who had to resign in 2017 after having unauthorized trips, meetings with Israeli officials, including Israeli opposition leaders, on a trip that she did not have authorization or go through the right channels for, and during which she reportedly discussed putting some international aid money towards the Israeli army and their running of field hospitals in the Golan Heights, which is highly irregular, to put it mildly. So having resigned over that, it is extraordinary that she has been given this high post.
I remember when that happened, and I remember the hysteria about everybody following her flight on the way home, on the way to be
Right.
sacked. She was a laughing stock. There was almost no conceivable way that somebody could come back from that.
As
Now,
yet.
and now she's Home Secretary. But it must be said, given, as you've alluded to, the way in which this government is going about in its attempts to reform the civil service, shake things up, she is very much a disposable figure, partly as a result of that history. And one does wonder whether or not she has been put in the Home Office entirely with that view in mind, to shake things up, to put noses out of joint, in the knowledge that if it goes too far, actually the government, it's not going to struggle to sack her and replace her with somebody else. I tend to view her as a sort of a sacrificial lamb in this sense, and that they know exactly what they're getting with Priti Patel. I agree. I don't think that she's going to resign over this at all. I think that they know full well what kind of an individual she is. That, that she's taking this very tough, abrasive approach, if you like, and that's exactly what they want.
Do you agree with some, though, that suggest that this tough, abrasive approach is just her being a demanding boss, being tough, but that actually, because she's a woman, she's facing more criticism?
Do you know what? No, actually, I don't think we should put too much on it just being her personality. I think that that's what the government wants. That's what they wanted, and I think if it hadn't been her, they could have found somebody else to go in and do this job. I think that ultimately the end goal is to shake up the Home Office and to try to reshape it in an image more in line with what Mr. Cummings and Mr. Johnson want, and I think that is going to be her role.
And in the statement, Sir Philip Putman accused her of shouting and swearing, belittling people, making unreasonable and repeated demands. Well, we should say Priti Patel has denied any of those allegations made against her. Shall we move on to the Mail on Sunday then, and leaked emails suggesting that Britain doesn't need farmers?
Well, this is a curious story in that it's been made by this economist, Tim Leunig, who, as far as I'm aware, once invited the ire of David Cameron because he suggested that a sensible economic policy for people living in economically destitute northern cities was to migrate en masse down south. And David Cameron laughed at him and said that this was ridiculous, ludicrous from start to finish. And yet he finds himself actually quite a senior embedded position in Whitehall. The suggestion here that the farming industry doesn't add very much to our economic output, that it's not necessary, that as a country we could afford to import this, that the fishing industry is the same. In terms of the numbers, there's actually quite a bit behind that to back it up. This is the problem, though, when you go entirely down the route of statistics and numbers and how things could work in favor of the economy, because it completely takes out of the equation the human question. Now, when you think about what it was that this government was elected on the back on, what Brexit happened on the back on, the rhetoric about farming communities, about fishing communities, real human stories of whole towns and areas being left behind. To have something like this come out into the public domain, where it's essentially saying that economists, very intelligent economists, are actively saying, well, we could do without them. That is economically true, but it is politically suicidal to say.
Raises the question about climate change as well. If you're going to import everything,
well, it's politically it's a mad thing to suggest that you could just let these farming communities, which are already left behind as it is, and fishing communities, which have long since been left behind, to just say to them, do you know what? They literally do not matter, and we can be open about this. It's an incredibly poor message to send.
We are out of time. Let's just end on a light note with a quick look at the Daily Star. Quackers, plastic ducks barred from a charity race. Why?
Because it's not very environmentally friendly to dump, hundreds of plastic ducks into a river. So,
and apparently they were told to use lemons instead.
Which may or may not float.
No, indeed. It is, and it's caused a lot of controversy. Annual organiser of the family event were told to use lemons. They were very angry. They said it raised thousands. But there is a point. Putting a whole load of plastic into our rivers is exactly what we're told.
When life gives you lemons, lob them into a river for charity. Okay, it's not quite catchy, but fine.
There you go. I'll give you that one. Benedict, Rachel, thank you both very much
so much
indeed.